It is Secret Saturday, Florida Maquis Patreon channel. If you are here, you are at the $5 level. This is basic entry-level training into psychological operations. Without this basic fundamental understanding of our own biases, our own psychological states, we will be completely disarmed in the new war, the war for the mind. Because once you can predict with any regularity how your enemy will act, they are no longer a threat. We're going to start today with bias. Speaking of it generally, everyone has it. I don't care what they say, they have it. We all have our own specific and unique set of experiences in our life that has covered and colored our biases. Biases, I guess I should say. Even I do. But once you're aware of it, you can begin to mitigate the effects of it. When we see a picture like this, to some, it would represent the way things should be. To others, it would actually misrepresent reality. That sometimes this picture on the right doesn't always tell the entire story. That instead of this person over here just being short, that maybe they wanted to sit down and not stand. Therefore, that's why they wanted the extra help. So they could be seated and still have the same view as the guy who was standing up. That's where this would be an unfair assessment. Here's another picture I thought that would work really well when you talk about bias. When you read the statement on the left, the Atlantic slave trade between the 1500s and 1800s brought millions of workers from Africa to the southern United States to work on agricultural plantations. Now, you could rewrite that phrase a million different ways that would tell the exact same story but with different bias. For example, you could change it around to mean that, say something as thus. From 1500 to 1800, the U.S. saw a giant influx of agricultural workers that led to the United States becoming a world power in the agricultural markets. It would say basically the same thing, but of course the first sentence being the Atlantic slave trade taken out colors it completely with an entirely different bias. It's subtle uses and tricks of syntax and vernacular that can either trigger or push away our biases. I've seen actually personally a lot of this lately, especially in the paradigm of Q, and then most recently the issue with Mr. Jones being caught looking at things he probably shouldn't look at and being caught accidentally doing it. This idea that if this person over here we know and can then verify is evil, anyone else who sees them as evil or verifies them as evil must then almost always be our friend, never acknowledging that evil can take many forms. And sometimes two different people that we both disagree with can have disagreements with each other. It's called binary thinking. And it's the next level. It's the physical representation of bias. This was something that disturbed me greatly. The channel that I have on YouTube began its life in late 2016, speaking about the Electoral College and how two very, very poor choices were leading people to fall back into binary thinking and bias. This is just another representation of it. We see this all the time, that a lot of times people will watch my videos, and I have the benefit of seeing all of the analytics and the demographics, and most of my videos I try to keep to 10 to 12 minutes. My average view time is about 5 minutes, and I know the time that I post them, and literally before anyone would have really even had time to watch the entire video and think about it, I'll have 6 or 7 or 8 comments about what the video should have been about, showing that the thumbnail and the title in the first 2 minutes, they made an entire assumption about the entire thing. This is just part of bias. People think that they have the ability to assess things immediately. And of course, groupthink reinforces bias, reinforces binary thinking. No matter what. If the group is doing it, or this particular group that I generally look like, I identify with, or I understand, starts doing something regardless of how detrimental it is, most people will allow their bias to move them forward. I had to bring this one up. I'm sorry about the whole flat earth thing, because they're just so funny. They really are. Because it's exactly going to look for something specific and then finding it, confirmation bias. It's something when you buy a car, for example, all of a sudden you start to see that car all over the place that you didn't see before, and you start to think it's more prevalent than what it is. It's one of the reasons that younger people who are trying to identify themselves as unique or not like the quote-unquote sheeple will heavily customize their cars to make it unique in their own, whereas you don't see that paradigm as people get older. It becomes less important. So you can almost tell who's driving a car, who owns a car, the age of that person, and sometimes you can tell even more simply by looking at the outside of it. This most recent and disturbing level of bias, I think most people on the left and the right would be very terrified by. Of course, on the left we have Molly Tibbetts, who is unfortunately the victim of a very violent crime committed by someone who was reported to be here illegally, but now we find that he's on a work visa. The person on the right was also killed by someone who really, for sure, absolutely, in fact, was undocumented and shouldn't have been here, but because she was not of a certain look, of a certain belief system, or from a certain background, for some reason, the folks in the mainstream media decided to ignore that story. And this is, to me, the most crowning glory of bias that I have ever seen in my life. I think psychologists and psychiatrists probably are going to be studying this paradigm for a very long time. See, the two people to the far left were pitted against each other as polar opposites, when for the vast majority of their lives, of the time that they knew each other, they were friends. Ran in the same circles, believed the same things, had the same group of friends. In fact, the guy to the far left spoke of the woman in yellow in glowing terms, in his own words, many times. And the people that supported him loathed her, hated her, accused her of all sorts of terrible, terrible things, and could have never possibly themselves seen themselves as being friends with the two people in the middle or identifying with them. Yet the man they supported did for decades. How could that possibly be if there wasn't a psychological operation in play? It goes to a very short memory of Americans, and the new cycle paradigms show this, that you can literally force information out of people's heads, and they will not be able to recall it. This is the basic understanding of psychological operations. That everyone has bias. Everyone has this weakness. Finding the weakness of your target is key. But also knowing your own weakness is even more important. And like I said, everyone has it. It's just identifying it and using multiple vectors to mitigate it. That's why psychological operations are never one-man operations. You have multiple inputs from multiple people with multiple backgrounds so that the operators don't get caught up in their own biases. So we'll leave it there. Secret Saturday, Florida Maquis Patreon channel, $5 level. Thank you so much for your participation. I greatly appreciate it. We will see you next week.